Culture too is a casualty of war. But after Russia's wrongful invasion of Ukraine, some Ukrainian writers called for a boycott of Russian music, films, and books. Others have all but accused Russian literature of complicity in the atrocities committed by Russian soldiers. Now, the entire culture, they say, is imperialist, and this military aggression reveals the moral bankruptcy of Russia's so-called civilization. The road to Buka, they argue, runs through Russian literature. Now, terrible crimes have been committed, I agree, in the name of the country, and anybody who has a Russian name. We can see how this war has turned the language of Pushkin and Tolstoy into the language of war criminals and murderers. Now, what does the world see of Russian culture today but bombs falling on maternity hospitals and mutilated corpses in the streets of Kyiv's suburbs? It hurts for anybody who's Russian. It hurts to be a Russian right now. Now, what can I say? What can I say when people are talking about a Pushkin movement, and it's being dismantled in Ukraine? Basically, anybody who's Russian just keeps quiet and they feel penitent, and they and they hope that perhaps a Ukrainian poet will speak up for Pushkin. Now, the Putin regime has dealt Russian culture a crushing blow, just as the Russian state has done to its artists, musicians, and writers so many times before. Now, people in the arts are forced to sing patriotic songs or immigrate. The regime has in effect canceled culture in Russia. Recently, a young protester faced arrest for holding a placard that bore a quote from Tolstoy. Basically. Now, Russian culture has always had reason to fear the Russian state, in the saying commonly attributed to the great 19th century thinker and writer Alexander Herzen. He was sentenced to exile for his anti-Tsarist sentiments and reading forbidden books, as he put it. The state in Russia has set itself up like an occupying army. The Russian system of political culture has remained unchanged and unchanging down the centuries. A pyramid of slaves worshiping the Supreme Khan. That's how it was during the Golden Horde, and that's how it was in Stalin's time, and that's how it is today under Vladimir Putin. Now, the world is surprised at the quiescence of the Russian people, the lack of opposition to the war, but this has been their survival strategy for generations. As the last line of Pushkin's Boris Godunov puts it, the people are silent. Silence is safer. Whoever is in power is always right, and you have to obey whatever order comes their way. And whoever disagrees ends up in jail or worse. And as Russians know only too well from bitter historical experience, never say this is the worst. As the popular adage has it, one should not wish death on a bad czar, for who knows what the next one will be like. Only words can undo this silence. This is why poetry was always more than poetry in Russia. Former Soviet prisoners are said to have attested that Russian classics saved their lives in their labor camps when they retold the novels of Turgenev, Tolstoy, and Dostoevsky to other inmates. Russian literature could not prevent the gulags, but it did help prisoners survive them. The Russian state has no use for Russian culture unless it can be made to serve the state. Soviet power wanted to give itself an air of humanity and righteousness, so it built monuments to Russian writers. Pushkin, our be all and end all, rang out from stages in 1937 during the Great Purge. And then, even when the executions trembled with fear, the regime needs culture as a human mask, or as a combat camouflage. That's why Stalin needed Dmitry Shostakovich, and Putin needs Valery Gergiev. Now, when the critics say Russian culture is imperialist, they are thinking of Russia's colonial wars, and they mean that its artists justify the state's expansionist aims. But what they do does not account for its Russia infernal imperialism. Now, before anything else, it was a slave empire when the Russian people were forced to endure and suffer the most. The Russian Empire exists not only for Russia's people but for itself. The Russian state's only purpose is to stay in power, and the state has been hammering the Ruski mirror, which is a Russian word, view into people's brains for centuries. The Holy Fatherland is an inland surrounded by an ocean of enemies, which only the Tsar and the Kremlin can save by ruling its people and preserving order with an iron hand. Now, for Russia's small educated class, the eternal questions, the cursed questions as the 19th century and intelligence knew them, they were framed by two great novels of the period, Herzen's Who is to Blame and Nikolai Chernevsky's What is to be Done. But for millions of illiterate peasants, the only question that mattered was, is the Tsar a real one or an impostor? If the Tsar was true, then all was well with the world. But if the Tsar proved false, then Russia must have another true one. In the minds of the people, only victories over Russia's enemies could resolve whether the Tsar was real or not. Now, Nicholas II was defeated by Japan in 1905 in the First World Order. A false Tsar, he was a false Tsar, he lost all popularity. Now, Stalin led his people to victory in the Patriotic War, World War II, so he was a real Tsar, and is reversed by many Russians to this day. Mikhail Gorbachev, the last Soviet leader, lost the war in Afghanistan and the Cold War against the West, and he is still despised. But through his triumph in 2014, easily annexing Crimea, Putin achieved the popular legitimacy of a true Tsar, but he may lose all that if he cannot win this war against Ukraine. Then another will come forward, first to exercise the false Putin, and then to prove his legitimacy through victory over Russia's enemies. Now, slaves give birth to a dictatorship, and a dictatorship gives birth to slaves. There is only one way out of this vicious circle, and that is through culture. Literature is an antidote to the poison of the Russian imperialist way of thinking. The civilizational gap that still exists in Russia between the humanist tradition, or the intelligence, and a Russian population that's stuck in a mentality from the Middle Ages can be bridged only by culture, and the regime today would do everything it can to prevent this. Now, the road to the Bucha massacre leads not through Russian literature, but through its suppression. The denunciations are books against Fyodor Dostoevsky and Mikhail Bulgakov, Vladimir Nabokov, and Joseph Brodsky, Anna Akhmatova, and Andrei Platonov, the executions of Nikolai Gumilev, Isaac Babel, and Perez Markish, and the driving of Marina Tisvateva to suicide, the persecution of Osip Mandelstam and Danil Karms, the hounding of Boris Pasternak and Alexander Solzhenitsyn. I'm not sure if I'm saying that name right. The history of Russian culture is one of desperate resistance, despite crushing defeats against a criminal state power. Now, Russian literature owes the world another great novel. Now, we sometimes imagine a young man who is now in a trench and has no idea that he is going to be a writer, but they ask themselves, what the fuck are we doing here? Why the fuck has my government lied to me and fucking betrayed me? And why should we fucking kill and die here? And why are we Russians fascists and murderers? This is the task of a Russian literature, to keep asking those eternal cursed questions. Now, who is to blame, and what is going to be done about this? So, yeah, that's a good question. Basically, they shouldn't be going through all this shit that's going on. But basically, the only person to blame for this Russian shit is Putin. But, like I said, he's the one that caused all this. And if he, so basically, there's only so much one person can do when it comes to this stuff. So, basically somebody has to stand up and say that what Putin's doing is wrong. But then they don't want to do that because, if you happen to notice, that every damn time somebody comes forward against Putin, or they either criticize him or call him out on something, that person ends up dead. So, but if you like the video, give the video a like and subscribe to my channel, RBW King. You can also hit the notification bell so that you'll be notified when a new video comes out. And if you want to support my work even further, you can donate to my Patreon link, which you can find in the About section of YouTube, and for just a little as a few bucks a month. Your donation can help go a long way, and thanks for listening.